Yeah. Are you having
Uh,
truckopolis down at
there is
the
truck
truck stop?
there is Trucktropolis because they become a city in and of themselves. And the 80 is closed, and there's the winds are going about 30 miles an hour, so
Mm-hmm.
not horrible, but just enough to blow the snow around, and the snow keeps falling. And
Mm-hmm.
we were going to have, and may still have, I don't know what the plan is, but some prospective members visit us early next week. And
Mm-hmm.
now it's looking like that may not, or that may either be a very unpleasant visit for them, which I suppose is par for the course,
Uh-huh.
or is going to be, maybe they might have to reschedule because
Mm-hmm.
of this, because it's much worse than even they thought that it was. So
Ugh,
that
yeah.
sucks. How are things in upstate New York?
Well, it's raining here and has been for most of last week, which I am just loving. Like everybody here is like, "Oh my God, it's so rainy." And we had this beautiful string of days that were like in the 70s and like almost up to 80, like record-breaking high temperatures for the spring around here.
You're
Which
like,
was
I
like
haven't seen rain in 5 years,
I
so
know
yeah.
exactly. And I'm like, I keep going outside and just like taking this like really deep breath and like feeling the moisture returning to my body after 5 years of, mostly being in Wyoming. So I am loving it. It's like, and I'm in this like super suburban looking neighborhood. I'm at my mom and stepdad's place in upstate New York. I've been here for, is it like 4 weeks now? Something like that. Yeah. And I'm here for a while and it's been great to like I basically took the train right into spring and that's been just lovely. So I'm enjoying the hell out of it and I'm sorry that
Spectacular.
Wyoming is Wyominging right
It's
now.
it's totally ridiculous. It's the weather is ridiculous. My hair is mildly ridiculous. I need a haircut. What There's not much else to report, just the huge. But we wanted to. Oh, and you're going on a writing retreat.
I am. I said I'm going to be in Canandaigua for a while, but actually on Sunday I leave here. So I've got my first shot. So I've been like partially vaccinated, and that's supposed to give you like 70% of the benefits or something. And so I'm going to like do something that feels a smidge risky. And I'm driving down to Tennessee, about 45 minutes south of Nashville on Sunday, and I'm going to spend 2 weeks in. I got accepted into a writer's residency program for 2 weeks down there, which I'm super excited about. And
Yay.
yeah, and I'm working on um, a a short story that's too long to be a short story and too short to be a novella, and I'm going to try to figure out what to do with that. That's actually a post-apocalyptic climate fiction piece set in Laramie. And so I'm working on that, but I'm also starting another book. So
Hmm.
that's being very exciting.
What's
And
the book about?
so it's about starting a community. So I'm gonna finally like write. I've been teaching those workshops for like 15 years, and I've got a really good writing partner and looking for possibly somebody else to join us on the team. And so we're going to do it finally. I haven't been able to get a job, so why not just write another book while I'm waiting to get a job?
Absolutely. Well, we
Yeah.
can't wait to add to your already, pretty impressive collection of books about a pretty niche and unique topic.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
so that's great. Well, congratulations and
Yeah. I'm like a
enjoy
niche
yourself.
superhero. Niche in. Yeah.
You're a cult boyfriend, as Jeffrey Lewis would
I
say.
am.
Yeah,
I am. Yeah.
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 So, but you wanted to come on and talk about media. Is that
Yeah.
because the TV's been on a lot where you're at?
It's because the TV is on a lot. And like not I don't think it's really on a lot, like by like mainstream standards, but it's on for the morning show, and it's the CBS morning show in the morning and local news. And so we're pretty close to Rochester, New York. So the local news is the Rochester station, and then in the evening it's like the news and and other than that, it's just like occasional cop shows. Like that's sort of like the exact content of what we're doing. So
So here's my impersonation of the local Rochester news, and you can tell me. So there was a robbery at Wegmans. Can you believe it? Wegmans.
yeah, kind
And
of,
then they
kind
went
of.
to Nick Tahoe's, and that's it. That's all I've
That's
got.
it. That's all you've got. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and the local news show, yeah. The local news show is not bad. I mean, it's like kind of a typical, standard local news show. I mean, I think they do a good job of like picking the stories that really need to be told. And then and but then there's the spin that's like so subtle. I mean, it's so interesting to me. Like I haven't been in a context for like I've never owned a television. Like the
I was
closest
gonna
I've
say,
gotten to.
when was the last time you've even been lived in a place where there has been broadcast television? I mean, you've lived
Not,
in lots of streaming where, people either stream or,
yeah,
watch, like recordings or streaming services, but
yeah. I mean,
I
I'm
don't
trying
think
to
you've been,
think.
I don't think you've had a functional TV in your domicile for way longer than I've known you.
Yeah, I mean, I think like so I haven't owned one as an adult, and I've been in communities that have had TVs, including, like we've got that big screen, but we don't have like a subscription to like a standard TV service. So
No, there's no broadcast or regular kind of thing.
no,
It's all
no. So this is
programmable.
probably the longest that I've spent in a household with mainstream media going. And it's mostly been like when I've been visiting my parents, that I've been exposed to it before. And it's interesting looking at some of the ways that it's changed. I mean, like one of the things, and this is just like God, the ads are so fucking irritating. But so when the last time that I was like exposed to like lots of commercials, the pharmaceutical commercials, which are still like a high percentage of the commercials on mainstream media, television, they were doing the thing where it's like they'd get to the potential side effects, and there's like this speed talking thing, but they're not doing it anymore. So it's shifted. And now what they're doing, which is kind of like more insidious and gross in some ways, is that they just keep the really pleasant music going. And it's this very pleasant kind of sing-songy voice about like all of the things, that terrible things that could happen to you if you take this drug. But it's like very poppy music and very like almost like disco beats, behind the thing. And
That
it's
sounds
so
pretty cool.
interesting. Yeah, well, it is, but at least the speed talking was like didn't create cognitive dissonance, like it's anxiety producing content over anxiety producing delivery, and trying to sort of like, we're going to rush through this because the feds require us to do it, but this is weird because it's like, there's this whole body of like media literacy stuff out there about like music and like what it does and how it functions in media. And so with these ads, it's like, oh yeah, this is just all good. Like that's what the music is telling that like deep unconscious part of yourself that responds to music. Well, meanwhile, it's like, and you might die, like over top of it. And it's like, it's just weird. Like I can't imagine that people don't have this like deep cognitive dissonance that just gets like gradually trained into you by hearing those ads like over and over and over again. And in an hour-long news program, you probably see four of them at least, in with all of the ads from like lawyers encouraging you to sue people over stuff. So,
Well, I'm
that's kind of like
thinking
the
about all
concept.
of this too. The way that it's structured and the content that's produced would make no sense absent there being a for-profit system
Right,
and an adversarial system and a system of liability that's not based necessarily on any kind of sense of community obligation or anything like
right.
that, but instead is based on this capitalist notion of adversarial liability.
Right. And those and the advertising, like there's this thread that runs underneath all of it where it's like, that like whether it's speed talking or the sing-songy voice over disco beats, it's like all about like cover your ass. I mean, that's really what it is. And it's like, so you look at the like almost all of the ads in some ways are about like you live in a really litigious society. Like
Yeah.
that's the underlying
You
message to
live in
all
a
of it.
risky
And
society
capitalism.
where
Right.
you are struggling for your survival every single day.
Right.
You're
Right.
struggling for your well-being every single day. Shit's really
Right.
hard.
Right.
We're going to help you within reasonable parameters of liability.
Right, right. Well, and which brings me then to like the news part of this stuff. And so, it's so interesting watching the like what a high percentage of the heartwarming stories about neighbors doing amazing things and coworkers doing amazing things that they should never fucking have to do if we were actually taking care of people. And like, this is like what passes for like human interest stories increasingly is like, we did this cool thing to like make it so that we can all survive capitalism for another day, but we're never going to say the word capitalism. And we're never going to actually acknowledge that that is what's running underneath all of this stuff.
And we can
And
do it as individuals, and individuals
totally.
making acts of incredible sacrifice, like
Yes.
sacrifice that makes us cry that they did
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Like the six
And
year old who raised funds to pay for
sure.
his classmates' cancer treatment. And it's like, why the fuck is a 6 year old doing that? Like,
Right.
ah,
Right. So
totally
there's a lot of
random.
that. So the news individualizes stories,
Mhm. Yeah.
and I want to hear more of what you have to say about that. But I also wanted to mention that a friend of mine, Dana Cloud, who is a rhetorician and has been a rhetorician at several institutions and a groundbreaking Marxist rhetorician, has had an article that changed my whole perspective on
Mm.
capitalism in the news, and it was called Operation Desert Comfort. And this was in the wake of Desert Storm, of the original, the
Mhm.
first incursion, Desert Storm, and talked about how all of these news stories talked about the families of the soldiers and the personal sort of struggles and the personal kind of things that they were going through,
Mhm.
and all ended with this sort of resolute kind of finality of, well, we have to take one for the team, and
Mhm. Mhm.
we can
Mhm.
just hope. We can't do anything about this. And that was the sort of the common argument that's being made in all these pieces is, we can't do anything about this. This is not a public matter that we are supposed to deliberate
Mhm.
on
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
debate about.
Yeah.
It is instead a private matter because we miss our kid, or I miss my husband, or I miss my
Mhm.
wife, or whoever is overseas.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
story after story after
Yeah.
story of that, which serves to depoliticize
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
which should be political. And I think
Right.
it
Right.
sounds like that's kind of what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, and there's a very interesting major story right now that's kind of, unfolding as we speak kind of thing, which is, so there was a really horrible storm. I think this is like in the Gulf of Mexico. I walked in partway through the story, so I missed some of the context to it. But so a boat capsized, and they've, one body has been recovered so far. One person was pulled out of the water still alive, but like 20 people are missing right now. And it was like 60 to 70-mile winds, totally weird. This is like the second time where I could diverge into climate change. I'm not going to do that on this because it's not the topic du jour. But one of the stories, and again, it's that kind of human interest story, and the personalizing it was, that they mentioned that. So one of these guys was only on the boat because he was picking up an extra shift for work. And that whole thing of like, and so, but then we don't talk about like, well, what does it mean to live in a society that doesn't pay enough wages, even for like these jobs, which are pretty well paid jobs, comparatively speaking, that people feel a need to put themselves at risk going into a really dangerous storm to pick up an extra shift. And this person is, has probably died because they picked up an extra shift. And that we don't, what's missing consistently from these national news stories is any kind of real analysis about kind of the underlying things. And it's been interesting. So there's a whole series of there's been multiple active shooter stories since I mean, just in the last month, multiple police shootings. The Capitol riots got a big story this morning because it's been, I think they said it's been 100 days since the Capitol riots happened. And so they had this big story about it. And so they talk about all of these things and they never utter the phrases white supremacy or racism, in spite of the fact that it is the thing that ties together a whole bunch of these stories. And it was so interesting this morning. So they did this big, like, pretty decent investigative journalism thing this morning on the morning show about the Capitol riots, where they interviewed all these people who had been decision makers in what led up to it. And then the anchor for the shows, who is this like lovely, empathetic, smart woman. So she ends it with, but so many of us are just trying to understand why this happened. And I'm like,
right.
okay, wait, you just told us a bunch of why it happened. Plus, everybody fucking knows, if they've been paying any attention at all, why it happened. But you're going to do this, like, sort of empathetically connect with my audience phrased, but we just don't understand thing. And it's like, you literally just undermined everything decent that you did on the show this morning, and you entered into people's minds, we can't understand this stuff, which is complete bullshit. Like,
it's
we actually
mystification.
Right.
It's
and
mystification.
It's intended to encourage us to stay in this state of, like, we can't know what's happening, we can't do anything about what's happening around us. And it's so interesting to watch. Like, that pattern in some ways has been like one of the most disturbing ones, that I've been watching. And they do it regularly. Like, they'll do these great stories that are, they're missing perspectives, but they're pretty decent stories, really. And then the anchors and the commentators around it will do these kind of like, oh, but silly us, we just can't understand kind of commentary that I think undermines people's sense of intelligence with it. And that's been one of the more disturbing patterns that I've been watching. And it sounds so empathetic. Like, it sounds like she's doing a good thing. But she and the guys too, I mean, they do it as well. I'm just literally like only picking out stories that have happened.
It's
in the last
weird
24 hours.
that the anchor serves as a kind of a regulator of what the audience can take away from the story, although the audience has also watched that entire story. So I don't know what that says about what they actually take away.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting. And there, so another one of those stories has been the Johnson and Johnson vaccine that is, currently on pause, and they've just been like hammering on that story a lot. And there's really nothing new to report from the first story, which was, the committee that's doing the assessment has asked for another week to assess it. That's the whole story. But they keep going back to it and like putting in these little weird side comments. And one of the guys this morning was like, you can get blood clots from COVID too. And it was like, what are you doing? Like, this is the kind of like dialogue about stuff that sort of like undermines, like, we have a responsible party right now that is trying to be careful and trying to assess and trying to like understand what's happening with this thing. And then we have like national news anchors that are like, but this is not a big deal, actually.
Well, it's a very like, social media kind of response.
Yeah, it is.
And
it is
sort of argumentative about that. But again, it sort of serves to obscure what's really happening. Do you have other examples?
Yeah, well, and and then of course the ads are popping up for like the next show up is Dr. Oz, and and it's like, why does this person still have a platform? And and the deal that I want to make with like national media is, so if Dr. Oz and Oprah, who are both like ridiculous neoliberals and like sort of new age thinking folks, I'm like, leave them their platforms, but give us like one hardcore socialist show to like try to balance some of this out. But like, of course, that's never going to happen because like mainstream media is like so much caught up in the sort of like neoliberal way of doing things. So when you're done, I want to talk a little bit about NPR. So I'm glad that we're
having
Oh,
this
good,
discussion.
good,
Yeah.
good. Yeah, well, so there's two other things that that I want to mention. So one of them is that, the New York State is about to reopen the schools, and it's been, it's been a big story, and it has been a developing story where it's not like they're repeating the same thing and just doing weird commentary. They're really trying to keep people up to date, and this is mostly with the local station now. And one of the things that I've noticed, though, is like who they are choosing to interview about things. And so basically, the only interviews that I've seen, and I haven't been watching it exhaustively, I've, frequently been holding myself up. So I may have missed some things, but all that I've seen are officials. And so there's state officials, there's principals being interviewed, and there's cute little 5-year-olds being interviewed about how much they miss their friends.
They
And
want
it's
to go back
awesome.
so much. Yeah. And
I
yeah.
want the kids to like have a voice, but it's like what we're getting is the top level official decision makers and then the youngest of the children. So we're not even interviewing high school students who, may have a little bit more sophisticated analysis. I haven't seen any interviews with teachers. I haven't seen any interviews
Oh
with
no. Oh
bus
no. They're not
drivers.
gonna. No.
Like,
Nobody wants to. We don't want to hear from the teachers.
right. And, we're not going to like talk to the working class. And there's one ad that has been run constantly since I've been here from that's a Black woman who is both a teacher and a parent. And it's all about, we need to get our kids back in the classroom. And so that is the only voice that is showing up in this whole thing at all, who's actually like a teacher or a parent. And it's an ad. It's not an interview. And so I was like, maybe New York teachers and parents are different than Wyoming. So I actually Googled this morning and I put in, I was like, how can I do this as neutrally as possible? So I put in teacher responses to New York schools reopening. So that was the phrase that I did. And once you get past the ads, the second article is about how the New York State Teachers Union is pushing back and has actually asked that there be a no tolerance policy where the first COVID case in a school triggers a 2-week closure of the school. That has not been in any of the news stories. So it's like there are other voices that could be being interviewed for this, but mostly what we're hearing from is the pushing to reopen dudes in suits kind of a thing. And it actually isn't just in this story, it's actually kind of all over the place. So one of the things that I've noticed is that the only like regular people who are getting interviewed are people who, for the most part, are eyewitnesses of horrifying things that are happening. So there's a carjacking thing happening in the Rochester area right now where like multiple people have been killed in attempted carjackings. Like it's a horrible story. And then there's like regular stories about house fires are a big theme. And the only people who are getting interviewed for those who are like people like you and me are people who are totally fucking rattled. Like they've just come out of this traumatic event. And so the contrast that you're getting is like, here's the professional class carefully taking care of us and, reopening our schools and like explaining things, and they're in their suits and they're in their office and they're staging their conversations. And then there's working class people who all sound like fucking maniacs because they've just been traumatized and they're being interviewed and their voices are shaking and they're crying on camera. And that is the only depiction that you're seeing of the working class in the news at all. And it's like, I want to like honor people's like deep trauma, but like, could we actually interview the calm, cool, and collected and intelligent, like working class people who are like in the trenches doing the work as well as the people who like deserve a platform for, dealing with these really traumatizing things. And that's been really, really disturbing. And it creates the situation where it looks like there's no intelligent dissent happening in Washington, New York State at all.
Well, I've never seen the mainstream media adequately cover or even begin to cover any kind of labor voice and any kind of union voice. Whenever there's a strike or a labor dispute, you only hear the company's point of view, you only hear the boss's point of view, and you hear about how the strike is hurting the economy.
Right.
And it's just an automatic default of anti-union, anti-teacher, or silencing, these workers altogether. You certainly don't hear from teachers. As you know, teacher politics played a big role in the struggle in Albany County
Yeah.
to keep keep the schools on a tiered system, and on a staggered system for months, which we managed to successfully do for several months until it just, kind of fell apart collapsed under the weight of conservative thought.
Yeah.
But in that instance, you didn't hear anything ever from the teachers unless they were part of a larger organizing effort that we had. But that's in Wyoming. But then you go to New York and you would think, well, the voice of labor should be more powerful there. And I agree with you, but I've just noticed that with mainstream media in general, no matter where you're talking about,
Right.
no matter how big the unions are. It was a big deal when Chicago, the things that Chicago teachers have done, the pushbacks that they've done over the last 3 or 4 years have been really fantastic. But you have to read labor specific or socialist literature and news in order to get that point of view and to get that voice. And that's why the organized labor, that voice of organized labor is so important. But and because in this case they are a bulwark against hastily returning to schools.
Right. Particularly, like, we have how much of the school year left? Like, why? Anyway, we won't go down that rabbit hole. But I do want to contrast it with a really good piece that we watched yesterday, and this was on Nova, which is not like, I don't actually know where Nova ought to be placed in the mainstream media thing, but it was this like really well done long-term investigative reporting piece about gender discrimination and sexual harassment in the sciences, and followed and did a really good job of like moving between like individual women's stories with it and then big patterns of things. And so I encourage folks to find that piece. Actually, it was really, really, really well done. And one of the women at the end said something that I think ties together a bunch of the stuff that, that I've been focusing on in my comments about mainstream media this morning. She's one of the women who has actually studied gender discrimination in the sciences and in academia in general. And she was talking about how she still has conversations with men who have long-term careers in academia who will say, I've never seen gender discrimination. I've been in this for 40 years and I've never seen it. And, and what she had said is that when people say that, it's like, there is so much evidence out there that it's happening and that it happens like all the fucking time. And that it affects deeply who actually ends up in academia. And so they were saying that when you look at incoming science students, and this was STEM students as a whole, it's about 50-50 men and women at this point. But then at every stage, you see women dropping out and dropping out and dropping out because of the sexual harassment, because of the gender discrimination. And it ends up being about 9% who actually get PhDs.
Wow.
But it doesn't start out that way. It's not about the interest. And so she said, you can say that from your personal experience, but you cannot anymore. It's deeply irresponsible at this point to say, and that means it's not happening, because we have so much data about it. And so I want to relate this back to, the anchor conversations that happen sort of around the news stories, and the way that there's we don't talk about class and we don't talk about economics. And there is so much evidence out there at this point that capitalism is actively killing people and that class discrimination is all the fuck over the place. But we don't talk about it, and we pretend that we don't see it, basically. And that's one of the things that I think is just getting reinforced by the messaging in mainstream media.
Certainly.
Yeah. And then I just want to name one other story that was very interesting that just broke this morning, that I don't really know what they should be doing differently with it, but it was just an interesting phenomenon that happened. And so last night, One of the local elementary school principals was arrested for what appears to be a at least 7-year long pattern of child sexual abuse in his schools.
Lovely.
And yeah, lovely, horrifying. Yeah. And, and this kind of thing happens. And what I realized, so I've had two situations in my life where I have found out that somebody that I was closely associated with was arrested for sex abuse. One of them was my high school debate coach, who was arrested my senior year in high school toward the end of the year. And the other one was somebody that I lived in community who my son had spent significant amounts of time with. And the shock that you feel when you find something like that out is incredibly disconcerting, destabilizing, et cetera. And what I realized was that so the police couldn't be talking about it before the arrest happened, because then people run, and so they don't make the arrests that they need to make. And this is the one place where I feel like law enforcement is like these are the times where this is an example of how law enforcement actually can do a good thing, is by doing these kinds of long-term deep investigations.
But you don't need cops to do that. I read an
Right, you don't
article
need cops to do that, and you don't
from
need
the
spray
police
guns, but
yesterday
somebody
actually
needs.
about this, but
Right,
that's
right.
a
No,
I
and I agree.
digress. But yeah,
And no, and mom and I were actually having that conversation this morning. We're
yeah,
like, no, I actually
you
need
do it.
cops for this.
Yeah,
So,
you can
so
create a special
it's a
anyway.
good thing, and I understand why they couldn't give people a heads up that this arrest was about to happen. But the arrest happened last night. The media puts it out all over the place this morning. There is no way in hell that school district was able to, even if they were able to communicate something to the parents and families who are currently in the school. This is a 7-year long thing. There's kids in high school right now who are probably other victims of it. And so all of these families just got this news over breakfast that their principal was arrested for childhood sex abuse.
Well, we better get statements from all of them then.
Well, and what's the trauma? What's the re-traumatizing and the further traumatizing? And all these parents who are now probably going, oh, fuck, I need to figure out how to talk to my kid about this. And what about the kids who were sitting at the breakfast table this morning who just heard this about their principal? And I don't know, the media should absolutely be reporting this and not protecting this person's reputation and all that kind of stuff. And I just think about the times when I've gotten that news and how rattling it was. And so I just have this open question for me about what should media do with this kind of stuff? And I don't know the answer to it, but there was part of me this morning that was like, whoa, wait a second. This is a really bad way to find this out.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
yeah. And you send your kids off to school and then get this, and it's like, anyway, and I don't know what to do with that. It was just an interesting other thing that popped up this morning. So yeah.
Well, and that's your dive into all the news that you've been watching after not really, seeing that subgenre of news for a long time.
Yeah.
So that must be, it's like the times where I've gone to other countries and watched their television and said, wow, there's some real wild differences here. And so that must be what that's like, is that you walked into a different country or a different planet or something.
Yeah, for sure. Well,
I
and
just
all the stuff that they say about all the underlying neoliberal messaging about mainstream media, spot on. It is totally true.
It so much is. I don't think that there's a better set of artifacts about neoliberal ideology than the mainstream media, and no one does it better than NPR. And I wanted to say something about that, because out here in the upper prairie country, there's slim pickings in terms of media. There's certainly no alternative media on the radio. The closest that we've ever had is the KOCA, was a low frequency or a low power FM station out here that did some alternative stuff, has done some alternative stuff over the years. But there's nothing, real going on in terms of broadcast journalism. except NPR and Wyoming Public Radio and National Public Radio. And this is so true, I think, of liberal and even neoliberal media, is that as an alternative, it's better than, in all of these different ways, it's better than listening to AM radio that is, has a news update every hour, and then just the out, everyone trying to outdo each other to find the most offensive conservative content that they can. Like, this host says that, this host spends an hour pointing out, that there are racial differences in who commits the most crime, and that there's black on black crime. So the other host has to be like, okay, well, then I'll just make openly racist jokes, because that's the only thing that's going to outdo, this guy. And everyone just trying to outdo each other to get punched in the face, basically. And which they, but they don't get punched in the face. They make a lot of money. And so compared to that, NPR is good. And most of the on the ground media folks, and all of the on the ground media folks that I know at Wyoming Public Radio are great people. They have different, kind of a variance of politics. And in some domestic issues, NPR is ahead of the game, and does a fairly good job on some things. Science, pretty good. Domestic economy stuff, not god awful all the time. Certainly god awful a lot of the time. But it's foreign policy where they just jump the shark every day, and they love the neoliberal order and its sort of carryover of the liberal international order, that the Wilsonian kind of order of and a US led world order, with the US exporting democracy everywhere, and constant vilification. Certainly during the 4 years of the Trump administration, it was Russia. Russia was the enemy all the time. Now China is the enemy all the fucking time on NPR. They outdo each other. They really are beating the crap out of each other to find the best anti-China stories that they possibly can. They want war with China. NPR wants war with China, and they want the United States to assert itself in this hegemonic way, and it's so nakedly, it's so obvious what they're doing. And if someone writes a book, somebody wrote a book predicting that we would go to war with China in 20 years or something like that, and using all of this geopolitical data. And of course, I'm looking at that and saying, you know what? Anybody could fucking write a book like that if they wanted to. I could write a book, saying that we're going to go to war, with, I don't know, some Micronesian entity in 20 years if I wanted to, and do that. And it's sort of nakedly, kind of appealing to the worst in our natures, and to watch that, and to hear these sort of erudite NPR hosts going, yes, and please explain why U.S. military superiority is so important in the coming, competitiveness that we're going to have with China. And please explain why everything China does is evil, even if it seems like it's good. And, please explain all of these things. And it's really it's terribly frustrating.
Have you heard any of their coverage about us pulling out of Afghanistan? That's been another one of the big stories.
I haven't. That just broke a couple of days ago, and I haven't had a chance yet. And I'll scream. I will, I will have a, I will have a Matt Christman moment, where the veins on my forehead, get really, really big, because there is this. No matter which way they go on it, they're making these geopolitical assumptions that are incredibly misleading and dishonest, intellectually dishonest, and it's the type of New York Times kind of thinking that that was as responsible as anything for the worst and most murderous foreign policy blunders
Mhm.
that we've seen in this century, time after time. And NPR doesn't question that. They don't question that logic. They never question that logic. They ride that wave. And so they're just as responsible for that kind of thinking. It's, and and just like it's just like these cable news channels, when it comes time, when there is some kind of military confrontation, it's like, well, we've got all of these people that are really into war on this panel, and they're going to be talking about all the different options that we have in
Mhm.
terms of the
Mhm.
warring. Hello, Dr. Wario. Hello, War McWhorter. Hello, General McWarface. It's nice to have
Yeah.
all of you on the show. Please talk more about how cool war is.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it
Yeah. There
really,
was a panel
it's
and
so absurd that anyone would
yeah.
accuse NPR of having a leftward bias on anything meaningful at all.
Mhm. Yeah, it was interesting. And I was sort of like, I had sort of reached my limit of how much I could take in. And we were also having dinner conversation at the same time that this panel was talking in the background on the TV. And I like really struggle with that. Like I can't, like my nervous system gets really overwhelmed. And so I just sort of tuned in and out last night as there was a panel of people talking about the Afghanistan pullout and just like how much like people are just like so distressed about like, but if we pull out, the terrorists are going to, and it's like, so we've been there for 20 years. Nothing we've done has changed that dynamic. Like, why do you people think that us staying there is going to like do something different than it has in the last 20 years? And it was just interesting to see that bias. And I think one of the other panelists was like a little more like, no, this is okay that we're pulling out, but it was just interesting seeing those voices
Mhm.
consistently lifted up of like, if the United States is not in there playing the save game, bad things are going to happen. And then like how many bad things have happened because the United States gets in there and like messes with and destabilizes the Middle East over and over again. And
But we have to have a hegemon, just like we have to
right,
have police. Police are
right,
inevitable, and I'm bitter because I'm having a conflict hangover over this, because I spent some time trying to convince some center right Democrats
right.
to read End of Policing yesterday, and I was like, just read it. I said, I will buy you the book if you promise to read it and have a discussion about it. And it's just,
Mhm,
it's that,
mhm.
it's a lot of those same kind of assumptions. And I'm thinking about everything you're talking about the sort of stripping of agency, and kind of this idea that we don't have agency and we can't
Mhm.
have discussions about what got us here in any of
Right.
these situations, whether it's an assault on the Capitol, whether it's issues with the politics of the political economy of vaccinations,
Mhm.
and whether it's crime and crime control, and different things like that. We can never, or teachers unions being shut out of the public
Mhm.
sphere. We cannot have conversations about those things which determine our fate,
Right.
or which confront the issues and the crises
Mhm.
that are in front of us. We can't
Right.
talk about that. We just have to listen, or the alternative, we either get to listen to experts, or we get to share our most raw, and again, sort of uh, unrefined and unshaped initial emotions about that.
Mhm.
So it's
Mhm.
either just this visceral emotional response, or it's listening to the experts.
Yep. Yep. One
Well,
one other thing that I want to say that
welp.
was well that was interesting this morning. So there was a story that was like that I was really glad was reported on of so there was a black woman police officer in Rochester who 15 years ago stopped her white partner from killing a black
Right.
man and then was
Yes.
fired.
And was vindicated
And she was fired. And
this
then
week.
they just this week restored her pension. And what was interesting about the story is that like so there's all so she's being interviewed. The interview's good, it's fine. And they never said, so you were a Black woman defending a Black man against white men's violence, and this is what happens. Like, there's not that. Let's put together the dots here of like how long this has been happening and thinking about. So for her, when that first happened to her, that was before Black Lives Matter was a thing. And so there wasn't this deep awareness. And so she was one of the many, many people who, there's all this stuff about like, well, it's only X% of like bad cops out there. And then, the other cops are going to somehow like, intervene. And like part of why that doesn't happen is because they get fired when they intervene. Like she was like charged with having like used inappropriate force against an officer, I think is what the thing was, where he was literally, she said the guy that he had in a chokehold looked like he was going to die. And so and that man still says she saved my life that day. And so, and so I don't know what it is about how we have constructed media where there's sort of this false notion of, being balanced and, not taking sides and all that kind of stuff. But what it equates to in real time and space is we don't analyze anything. And we're not allowed to put together dots, even when they're blatantly obvious, with stuff. And that's the biggest challenge that I'm having with stuff is the like, what's the rest of the story? Like, I just keep walking away going, where's the rest of the story?
Well, and guess what? Nature abhors a vacuum. And so, since we are not being treated to any of that or being allowed to kind of do it ourselves as part of normal public discourse, well, guess what? There are a hell of a lot of YouTube videos that will explain exactly what's going on to you, and you won't even have to think about it. They will do systematic analysis that leads to Nazi conclusions or racist conclusions or sexist conclusions. And they will sort of take advantage of that vacuum and say, we're going to teach you how good it feels to own people and to be to make ridiculously or absurdly cruel kinds of arguments or really edgy conclusions. And so it's not that analysis isn't going on. It's that even with that stuff, it's being guided by algorithm and by purposive kind of micro-targeting in many cases. If you listen to some of the podcasts that Adriel Hampton and I did last year, you learn about micro-targeting with that. And so these alternative sources of getting information are themselves often the road to right-wing radicalization, or at the very least just complacency and complicity in the violence, the cycles of violence that go on against people. Now, the liberal dream, the sort of liberal American dream of the marketplace of ideas, was that institutions would evolve where people could have these larger conversations and these deeper conversations. And that was at one time we thought the university was going to be the place to do that. And we also thought things like public television and other kinds of sort of public sphere and civic kind of minded things were able to do these things. But of course, all of those things got colonized and gutted by capitalism.
Yep. It is always follow the money. And yeah. And, one of the other things in the Nova special last night that was really interesting is, so there was this one guy, his last name is Marchand, I think, who sexually harassed all of his field assistants for years and years and years. And one of the stories that they followed in real depth was one of the women who eventually pushed back, filed a Title IX complaint, and he was eventually fired. But part of what she was talking about why she didn't do anything about it sooner, is that he controlled the purse strings for who was getting funding and who had access to the field work that they needed to advance in their careers in the way that they wanted to. And that, one of the women, a woman of color, like ended up having to like let go of her big dreams because this guy like actively interfered with it. And it, it's a way of like locking in victimhood. And so the ways that like our oppression is locked in, even in those spheres that are the public spheres that aren't privatized technically, but it's still all about like follow the money and like who actually has control over the funding and who's paying the bills and what are their biases. And, all of this stuff kind of converges in these like really horrifying locked in dynamics for people in like so many different spaces, including in the academic world.
Well, lots of food for thought,
That's a food
and
for
this
thought.
is what happens when you get shoved into, have sort of force-fed some network TV news and local TV news for a few weeks. So
Yeah.
I'm glad that you were able to put it to good analytic use.
Yeah, it's been very interesting actually. And I do want to say in my parents' defense that they're not making me watch it with them. It's just on in the background. So, I'm
Yeah.
force fed is probably
Everybody's older parents has TV on in the background a lot. I think that's a rule. I think that's the law.
yeah,
So it's
cool.
it will if you turn it off, it'll turn itself back on, and it'll be like, are you sure? Are you sure that you don't want? But
You sure you didn't want to hear our indoctrination du jour? Come on.
well, well, it's been great talking to you, and keeping in touch with your journeys. And everybody at Solidarity House and Solidarity Collective misses you very much, and we look forward to having you maybe join us for some other conversations, including conversations about some reshaping and rethinking of some of our practices and norms and things like that we're going to
Well,
do. So, but in the meantime, it sounds like you've got a good time coming up with your writers retreat. Be safe, and thank you so much for joining us this morning, Yana Ludwig.
yeah, thanks for talking. It was
Yeah.
fun.
All right. Well, see you later.